Another month ends, and what a month it was. We entered a new season, we had a whole bunch of points updated, and we had the balanced data slate. And so, of course, everybody's eyes are towards those top armies, and are they still going to be the top armies going forward? Well, let's talk about just that. Let's have a look at the top armies from the month of June. Let's look at how many top 4 placings they got and rank the armies based on this. Then we can look at the top 10 armies from last month, and let's have a talk about how these armies are going to have to change going forward. So then, in 10th place, we actually have 2 armies for last month. We have the Adeptus Custodes and the Grey Knights. Let's start off then by talking about the Custodes. They got relatively few changes, I think, compared to a lot of factions. However, I think generally Custodes players might be a bit upset because there definitely are some things in the Custodes range that probably need some help. So things like Terminators, Sisters of Silence immediately jump out to me. There's not a huge number of builds that are really working at this point in time for Custodes. And so seeing points hikes on Trajan, the Galatus and Achilles Contemptors is going to hurt them a little bit, but it could be much worse realistically. Interestingly, a lot of the nerfs we saw in the previous balanced data slate weren't taken away. So for example, the nerfs to their OBSEC, etc., which I think a lot of people were expecting to go. I think generally speaking, the feedback to GW was that they kind of went too far with the nerfs to Custodes in some areas, but I guess we will see. They are definitely going to be one of the factions, in my opinion, that struggles the most with To the Last and Stranglehold being removed. They have got a little bit of secondary support with a few of their secondaries being reworked, which is great. However, I do think they're not going to be in as strong a spot going into next month, but we'll see. So then on to the Grey Knights. They've kind of come out okay after this balanced data slate. With Armor of Contempt, they've got some really interesting play, especially because things like Paladins can be massively buffed. They did get a few interesting points drops. The Wisdoms and Gifts went down 5 points. I think that's probably the most impactful one in my opinion. And then maybe somebody will make a case for taking Storm Ravens and Land Raiders at this point. However, I doubt it. I don't think it's going to change too much when it comes to general Grey Knight list design. I think again we've got some missed opportunities for the Grey Knights. I know it might sound like you could say this of pretty much every faction in Warhammer 40k, but factions like Grey Knights and Custodes don't have a huge amount of options in their book. And so when we've got units like Purgation Squads, for example, that we don't really see much of competitively, it would have been pretty obvious in my opinion to drop a few points there, but hey ho. In terms of their secondaries, they did get some changes. I think Purifying Ritual people were expecting to change, and it has been slightly nerfed. Their secondary Destroy the Demon is probably a bit less of an auto take, which, let's be fair, makes sense. And interestingly, Teleport Assault got improved. I wonder if people are more likely to build in teleporting units into their Grey Knights list so they can kind of jump around the board, kill lots of stuff, and grab a lot of juicy points. Overall, I think Grey Knights are looking in a pretty good spot because, of course, a lot of the armies above them have gotten nerfed and they've stayed in roughly the same spot. On to 9th place, and we've got the Chaos Knights. Interestingly, Knights and Chaos Knights seem pretty well balanced with some very reasonable win rates, which is quite surprising because, as we all know, the new factions this year have typically been incredibly strong, and actually Knights are pretty tough to balance for the game of Warhammer 40k. So this book was clearly quite well written. The most popular Chaos Knight choice is certainly House Herpetrax. It has a pretty great bond with +4 wounds on all of your Titanic Knights and +2 wounds on all of your War Dogs, and it definitely seems like War Dog spam is one of the most popular choices right now. The Warlord trait allows you to ignore most modifiers in the game. It does exclude degrading, however. The Relic grants an Aberrant or War Dog -1 to hit, and it's got a pretty neat stratagem which will deal out mortal wounds to enemy units within 6 inches of the knight. Of course, knights have great big bases, so this can be pretty cool in the right circumstance. And just to take a moment to talk about our sponsor for today's video, Skillshare. I always want to make the best videos possible for you guys, and Skillshare is the perfect place to build on those skills. Skillshare is an online community with thousands of inspiring classes, and so if there's software you're interested in learning how to use, they're gonna have classes for it. I think one of the main reasons I really enjoyed the classes relevant for me was because they gave me things I could do almost immediately, ways I can improve the quality of these videos, get them out out quicker, and I started to see the improvement in quality almost immediately. More generally though, Skillshare is the perfect space for anyone who loves learning and wants to explore their creativity and learn new skills. If you want to get better at public speaking, learn more about the stock market, or develop those artistic skills so you can do some amazing freehand on your models even, then Skillshare is the place to be. There's a link in my description, and the first 1,000 people to click that link will get a month's free access to Skillshare so you can see what I'm talking about. Go and start your journey. Then into 8th place, where we have got the Dark Kin, it is the Drukhari. They interestingly also didn't get any balanced data slate changes this season, which I think makes sense. The Drukhari were in a pretty good spot going into these changes. One thing that did stand out was that Never Stationary, their version of Fire and Fade, did not get limited to once per game, whereas Fire and Fade, which affects Harlequins and Craftworlds, did. So that's a pretty big difference between those factions. Now, interestingly, Witches were one of the scourges of early 9th edition outside of course, Scourges, and they have actually got a points drop. Going down a point, not the biggest change in the world, but you know what? It could be quite impactful. Witches had really fallen out of favour with a lot of Drukhari players, no doubt. Witches kind of have an interesting spot in the Drukhari Codex in my opinion, because of course they're nowhere near being one of the fastest units in the book, but they're also not particularly durable, and because they're fighting with Rax for that spot, I do wonder whether many Drukhari players will take advantage of this change. In terms of their secondaries, Herd the Prey, a very popular Drukhari secondary, did get taken down a peg just a little bit, so now it's only 1 point per quarter per turn. However, you can now score it turn 1, and it's still just a very good secondary, so that's pretty good for them. But I think one of the big wins for Drukhari is actually their other 3 secondaries all got some pretty interesting buffs, and that's a huge factor. In the coming months, I think that the armies with faction-specific secondaries that are easy or reliable to score are going to perform really well, and I think there's a good chance Drukhari will be in that group. We've got 2 factions here who both had 6 top 4 placings, and the first one we're going to talk about is the Imperial Knights. Like with the Chaos Knights, they did not get a huge number of changes. However, I do think they are going to really enjoy being able to take multiple faction-specific secondaries. Renew the Oaths, House of Honor, and Yield No Ground are all pretty solid, especially now that Stranglehold has gone. And I think secondary play for Knights is super important because, of course, having few models on the board makes it traditionally really tough to play the mission. I think a lot of people are surprised that Imperial Knights have come out the gate just that little bit stronger, it seems, than Chaos Knights, although it is early days. I think part of the reason here is that both Chaos Knights and Imperial Knights are taking many small knights, and a lot of the Imperial Knights, it seems, are basically just designed to buff those units. And so as an Imperial Knight player, your armigers are going to have some really great flexibility that will help you out. So how do I think the biggest boys on the block are going to do into the coming month? Well, I think we're going to see some really strong performance from both Imperial and Chaos Knights, because in a similar way to factions like Grey Knights, they haven't had a huge number of changes. However, the factions that were really good against them, so particularly things like Tyranids, they are definitely going to go down in value. We might see the rise of things like Hammerheads, which could definitely deal a blow to Knight superiority. However, outside of that, I do think you can perform really well in tournaments with either of the Knight armies. The other army with 6 top 4 placings for the month of June was the Harlequins, and they have taken some big changes. Not so much in terms of points, in fact only a points increase on the Death Jester. However, they got hit pretty hard in the balanced data slate. So firstly, you no longer get the base of 3 rerolls from Luck of the Laughing God. So you're going to have to gamble responsibly, because those are the only extra rerolls that you get. It's probably worth mentioning that those rerolls are basically more valuable now in my eyes because of the reduction in CP at the start of the game, but this is going to really reduce the potency of the army, so we will see how they survive this. Then we've also seen nerfs to the Light and Dark Say Death. The Light Say Death ability, where they can only be hit on a 4, 5 or 6, is now only applicable from over 18 inches away. That of course means that if you're willing to get up close and personal with the Harlequins, you're going to be able to destroy lots and lots of space clowns. The nerf to Dark Say Death was also really pronounced. Instead of being able to fight on death when destroyed in combat, they now roll a dice on a 4+, they deal a single mortal wound. That's a huge nerf. I think it's likely that Twilight is going to see more play because that extra attack is always going to be useful. And I do just want to talk about the Harlequin secondaries because they did get some nice buffs in the Nephilim book. And so Harlequins players still have some great output and scoring potential, but will they be survivable enough, especially now they're getting less favour from the Laughing God? So now we're into the top 5, and the first army we've got to talk about with 7 top 4 finishes last month is the Adepta Sororitas. Sisters of Battle very obviously were one of the best armies last month, and this is pretty notable because they got some pretty big buffs. I think this is going to put them in a really strong position. Firstly, we've got to talk about some points drops. They got some which I think were pretty necessary. You know, some of the units didn't really see a lot of play. However, Zephyrim, Seraphim also got points drops, and they're staples in most Sisters lists, so I'm not entirely sure what the logic is there. Additionally, the Sisters secondaries are really good now. They've got great secondary play. You actually won't have to interact massively with your opponent to score pretty well with a Sisters list, so I think it's pretty fair to say the Sisters are probably going to be one of the best armies in the game at this point in time. They have huge play, and they've got some really efficient units. They were one of the factions that loved Armor of Contempt the most. They've had that Bloody Rose supplement, which is really strong and most people seem to be leaning into. So Sisters are in a pretty great spot. We will see just how far they can go in the month of July. 4th place, and let's talk about the poster boys then, shall we? We've got the Space Marines with 11 top 4 finishes for last month, but how are they looking after all of the changes? Well, actually pretty good. It does vary, of course, quite a lot depending on the chapter. However, generally we got some nice changes. So, you know, some points drops on Outriders, Centurions, Eliminators, Assault Squads now have free jump packs. That's pretty cool. Makes them a really useful unit for playing the mission, and in some chapters like Blood Angels actually still a really decent combat threat. A whole bunch of the tanks and the speeders got points drops. However, I'm not entirely convinced this is going to have a massive impact. As we know, without the core keyword, they just won't have the synergy with the Space Marine army like things like Dreadnoughts get, of course. And in terms of the faction specific drops, we got some pretty cool ones. So most of the named characters, it seems, actually went down in points, which is pretty cool because characters like Guilliman or Adrax Agatone are actually a pretty great reason to pick one of the chapters competitively. And so hopefully that frees up a few points, which helps out some of the lesser seen chapters. I think Blood Angels are undoubtedly a big winner from the points drops. They got points drops on both Sanguinary Guard and Death Company. Sanguinary Guard were already a very popular choice after Armor of Contempt, and so getting a drop on one of their best units is obviously going to be huge for them. Dark Angels, I think the Black Knights and Deathwing Knights are probably the units I'm most excited to see. I don't think this is enough to make them a properly competitive option. However, I would love to be wrong about that, and maybe somebody will make it work. I guess we'll have to wait and see. And then, of course, the secondary overhaul in Nephilim is huge for Space Marines. There has been a nerf to Oath of Moment, which I think most people were expecting. However, every chapter with a supplement in the game right now has its own secondary, and some of them are really good, particularly easy to score. And so this could massively change the dynamic of which of the supplements are actually competitive in the month of July. I'm excited to see if we'll see a resurgence in some of the chapters that we haven't really seen much of this year. And thus we hit the podium, starting off with 3rd place with 14 top 4 finishes for last month. We have the Tau Empire. They did take some big hits to their star pupil, the Crisis suit, as we were all expecting. Both the Crisis suit and the Bodyguard suit went up in value. The Airburst went up, the Plasma went up, which was probably the most popular choice I see in lists. and this is undoubtedly going to have a big effect. Additionally, we did see the shield drone go up in points, which I don't think people are going to miss. Crisis suits can be incredibly tanky if you build them in the right way, and so making it so that crisis suits can't be spammed to quite the same degree probably seems fair. A lot of the supporting characters have gone up in points, as have the broadsides also. I think Tau players are going to have to delve a little bit further into that codex, have a look at some of the units that maybe don't see as much play. So things like stealth suits, breachers and devilfish, hammerheads, these units are actually still pretty points efficient for what they bring to the table. And so I do think Tau are going to have some great play going forward. Tau did get a small boost to their secondaries, however, they were big fans of To the Last and Stranglehold, so these changes will undoubtedly affect them as well. And then the silver medal for the month of June belongs to the Craftworld Eldar, the Asuryani. They had another really strong performance, Hail of Doom remaining the most popular choice throughout these lists. So of course this trait, now becoming all-consuming, is undoubtedly going to affect a lot of these armies. Likewise, you can see that many players are putting multiple Farseers into their lists. They are just quite good and the Eldar psychic powers remain really strong. However, Eldritch Storm against the right opponent was absolutely devastating before, and multiple Farseers helped you build that storm to be even larger. And so I am curious to see if in the coming month people drop the number of Farseers in their lists now that Eldritch Storm has been nerfed. And then I guess the final rules changes that might affect these lists are the changes to Matchless Agility and Fire and Fade, essentially reducing Craftworld Eldar's ability to shoot you without you shooting them back. You're just going to be removing Craftworld squads pretty quickly, and so it's going to be a very difficult army to play. And so people might have to change their lists just to add a little bit of durability into them. They also got hit hard when it comes to the points. A lot of the characters went up in points. Some of them you weren't really seeing much anyway. However, Baharoth, for example, was incredibly popular, as were the Swooping Hawks, who also went up in points. When you combine that with the fact that To the Last is also gone, I wonder if we'll continue to see those into July, and a lot of the other Aspect Warriors also went up. And so we've got a great many changes that Eldar players are going to have to account for, and so I think potentially the top lists for Craftworlds next month could look very differently to how they look right now. And so Craftworld Eldar with 15 top 4 places for last month were only surpassed by the Tyranids with 37 top 4 places for last month. Still incredibly strong after the first round of nerfs. However, this second round might have just done the trick. They were hit very, very hard. So firstly, the rules changes. The Hive Tyrant now has to be your Warlord. Now that's not too impactful on its own. However, there is a rule that now says once your Warlord dies, you no longer get your Synaptic Imperative abilities. It means you can no longer catapult your Flyrant up the board and hope he just kills a whole lot before he dies. You now have to be very tactical with your Warlords. So I think that's a good thing. And you can no longer tailor your Tyranid lists to whatever you play against by just choosing a biomorphology that cancels out one of their main abilities. You have to pick your biomorphologies when writing your army list. I appreciate Tyranid players love the adaptive element of Tyranid lore. However, it was undoubtedly brutal to play against, where they could just turn off key things that your army was good at. In terms of the points increases, well, there's a lot of them, to be honest with you. A lot of the heavy hitters have, of course, gone up in points. Hive Tyrants, Tyranid Warriors, Maleceptors, Pyrovores, Harpies. A lot of the favourites saw decent points rises. Some of them might be now pointed too high, and I don't know if you'll see all of them. However, things like Tyranid Warrior spam is still pretty good, especially, of course, as Hive Fleet Leviathan, where they get that transhuman physiology. So I do think Tyranids are going to stay in a good spot. The Tyranid dominance over the last few months has been the most dominant I have seen any faction since making these videos, so I am quite excited to hopefully have another army in this number 1 spot. I guess we will see. And there we have it. Those were the top 10 armies for last month, and how I think people might have to change their lists now that we've had a whole bunch of rules updated. We've also now got the Necrons on the scene, and of course Chaos Space Marines rising up. So who do you think is going to be the best faction in July 2022? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this content, if you found it useful, please do consider liking and subscribing. And if you want to support the channel, you can do so by clicking the join button on the page below. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.